Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our hope. Amen. So that's one of the most familiar stories that we know. Let me say it a little differently. The Good Samaritan is one of the most familiar characters in the Bible. Nope, that still doesn't do it. You know what a Good Samaritan is, right? You know what a Good Samaritan is. You ever had one of those moments where you get a flat tire at the side of the road, and somebody pulls over to help you, right? That's a Good Samaritan, right? They're in the news all the time. Hang on here. You might have seen some of these stories in the past week. Oh, phenomenal Good Samaritan drives 1,300 miles to rescue stranded family in their cross-country voyage. That was from Australia. They were on their way to Darwin, and they were 600 miles short when the car broke down. And that's like, I've never been to Australia, but I understand that's like literally the middle of nowhere. Like it's desert. And some guy drove from Darwin out to get them. Good Samaritan, right? Here's another one. This one's actually kind of sad, because sometimes this kind of thing happens, right? Good Samaritan, you've probably seen these stories. Good Samaritan cleared after fatal highway crash. Person pulled over to help, and then a truck came along, didn't see the vehicle until the last moment, had to swerve out of the way. The fact that the person's name was Trudeau, by the way, has nothing to do with anything. And had to swerve out of the way, and unfortunately then hit somebody, and they charged the woman who left her vehicle, the person who'd stopped, because she'd left her vehicle out in the road slightly. But the judge said she was a good Samaritan who stopped to help her fellow man. And here's just one more. I don't know if you saw this last week, but Good Samaritan surprised by identity of stranded Halifax bus passenger. Did you see this story? Woman in Halifax pulled up at the corner. A bus had stopped, but then it pulled away as a woman with 2 kids ran up to the bus, and the bus driver wouldn't open the doors. He just drove away. So the woman went over to help. Turns out, the person that she was helping, did you see this story? I'm sure you did, a few months back, of a Syrian family whose children were all killed in a fire in Halifax. It was a mom. She was on her way to the hospital to see the dad. After a few minutes driving, Martin, that's the person who stopped, learned they were going to visit the woman's husband. Good Samaritan, right? Well, you know it is, because the headline was Good Samaritan surprised by, and the news never lies. The thing is, we've come to understand that's what a Good Samaritan is. It's a stranger who stops to help a stranger, which is great. It absolutely is great. That's a really good thing. That's not a Good Samaritan. That's somebody who lives like Jesus. And it's actually kind of not the same thing. The story of the Good Samaritan isn't just about a stranger who stops to help a stranger. Think about the context in which Jesus tells the story. It's about who is my neighbor. There's the best thing ever is to help someone in need, whether you know them or not. It's the best thing ever. That is living like Jesus, even. That's what Jesus teaches us. The story of the Good Samaritan is a little bit different, because Jesus intentionally tells you who the person is who stops. And if you're a first century Jew, you hate Samaritans. And unfortunately, that's because they're Jews. But they're not the right kind of Jews. Right? See, Samaritans are Jews who believe that the house of God isn't Jerusalem, it's Mount Gerizim. That's where God lives. And Samaritans consider themselves to be inheritors of the original traditions of the Jewish people, right? They are not like post-captivity, post-Babylonian captivity Jews, which are the state of Israel today, right? They're Judah. They're in this story. They're Judeans in this story. But Samaritans are different. They believe a couple of things a little bit differently, and they don't see themselves as being the same. And you might think to yourself, oh, okay, so that's like being United Church and Lutherans. No, it's not, because they were violent enemies. They did not like each other at all, and didn't respect each other at all, and they fought. It's a little bit calmer now, but in the first century, it's a lot calmer now, but in the first century, if you were a first century Jew from Judea, you would know that you're supposed to hate Samaritans. Let me say that again, because I intentionally mean to say it that way. If you're a first century Jew, you know you're supposed to hate Samaritans. So the question here is, though, did Jesus use that stereotype? Did Jesus name the person as a Samaritan? Remember, this is Jesus too, right? So one of the other characters is a priest. Right? Jesus didn't always have the utmost respect for the leaders in the temple. He's always at odds with them. And there's a Levite, another leader in the temple. So we have a couple of characters that you know Jesus personally spoke out against. And then a Samaritan. So did Jesus choose a Samaritan because he knew his audience would know that was somebody they were supposed to hate? Or did Jesus choose a Samaritan because he was a first century Jew? That's really worth thinking about. If you want to think about that in a really humorous way, there's a British comedy duo called Mitchell and Webb who did a really funny skit about it, in which Jesus is telling the story, and then somebody in the audience who's hearing the story goes, hang on a second. I happen to like Samaritans. They're perfectly fine people. And then somebody else goes, yeah, we vacationed in Samaria last year. They were just lovely to us. They were and the crowd starts to talk about how they actually like Samaritans. And one of them actually comes out with that he thinks that this reflects the inherent racism in Jesus' story. And it's a really funny way of making a real important point here. The Good Samaritan story isn't about a stranger helping a stranger. It's about somebody you're supposed to hate helping you. That's a lot different. Because that should cause you to reflect on who you might not stop to help and why. It might cause you to reflect also on who you might accept help from and why, or why not. There's lots of ways, there's lots of contemporary context using culture and racism. There are. I wish there weren't, but there are. And that would change even in the context of not just the society or the place you're telling the story, but with the individuals. So maybe the point of the story here isn't just about showing compassion to a stranger. Maybe this story is actually about asking you to ask yourself the question, neighbor. I know you want to answer the way you should, which is everyone. The point of this story, Robin, everyone is my neighbor. Are they, though? I mentioned the thought that did Jesus tell this story and name a Samaritan because of the audience or because of Jesus being a first century Jew telling the story? We know what we're supposed to think is the thing. And I imagine there was more than a few people hearing this story for the first time from Jesus who might have also gone, oh, okay, I get it. I get it. That's why you mentioned Samaritans. Yeah, I get it. And I agree with you 100%, Jesus. We're supposed to love our enemies, even if it's somebody that we've been told and taught we're supposed to hate, even if we don't hate them. We've been taught that. So there's two levels here. There's an individual and there's a society level. I get that. It's an important notion, Jesus. Thanks for sharing. But did you ask yourself the question? We know what we're supposed to think. But it's much harder for us to personally learn how to do rather than what we're supposed to do. Somebody told us we should. The news is full of stories that tell you who you're supposed to be afraid of. Politicians are getting really good at doing that, sadly, because there's times historically, you'd think we would have learned, when politicians have done that very thing in order to gain control. They tell you who you're supposed to hate, and they blame them, and then you're on the politician's side. But Jesus says, no, you're not supposed to hate them. In fact, you're not supposed to hate anyone because everyone is your neighbor. And that's not just a question of don't hate them. It's a question of, are you prepared to offer help and compassionate care when people are in need? Are we? Have we actually truly thought about or experienced that moment of deciding whether or not you should help this person because of who they are or how they look or where they might be from? Have we thought about or experienced truly that moment of accepting help from someone, regardless of who they are, how they look, where they're from? It's great to, believe me, it truly is. It's great to understand that there's an element of compassion, living compassionately in this story. There's an element of helping a stranger. But there's something deeper here too, which is always the notion of Jesus teaches this. Is it behavior or is it something that's truly in our hearts? And the question here is, truly in your heart, have you asked the question, is there? And why is that someone that you feel that way about? Why? And what can you do about that? That's the moment at which it becomes more than adjusting our behavior to what Jesus teaches and living the love that Jesus wants us to share, the love that's in us. Now we're going to go around the room and I want you to answer my question. No, I'm not. I'm kidding. Of course not. Because this is a moment where we as a community of faith have to acknowledge that the community is, and this is, a family is the best language here, right? Because we're all different, but we're all connected. We're all different. And there are moments when we need to take the community story, the story that we just heard together, and ponder it for ourselves. There always is that moment, by the way. But here's a story that really needs that. Here's a story where Jesus isn't preaching to a crowd, he's talking to one person and helping them understand the difference between these are the words of the law, of course I would behave that way, and understanding what's at the heart of that. Who is my neighbor? And it's really easy to answer that by saying, everyone's your neighbor. You know what to do with that. But the real answer to that is, yes, everyone is your neighbor. But you may not know that. You may not think that. You may not feel that. Because you personally need to engage that personally. And ponder that, wonder at that. Think about that. There's no test except for you to find yourself in that moment where you either need to offer help or receive help from someone that you suddenly find yourself reluctant. Why? And what can you do about that? Because that's the deeper part.